8th grade in lesson 12.1 on the Pythagorean Theorem. You watched the interactive student edition on my HRW, and in that interactive student edition they proved to you how a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That a represents one of the legs of a right triangle, b represents the other leg of a right triangle, and c is what we call the hypotenuse, which is the side of the right triangle opposite of the right angle. Okay, so here in number 1, we have triangle RTS, right triangle RTS. And as you can see, this little box right here, this signifies to us a right angle. Okay, so for a right triangle, what a squared plus b squared equals c squared tells us is that if we take one of the legs of the right triangle and square it, and add that to the other leg of the right triangle and square it, that is equal to the length of the hypotenuse squared. So leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. And so in number 1 on the 12.1 form, again, you need to show all your work on lined paper, just like the directions tell you to do. And so the first thing I would do is set this up, set it up. So I'm looking here, I see I have a right triangle, so I know I can use a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I would set it up by writing that equation, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Then I would plug in the values that you know. Well, here I see that I'm given this leg and this leg. They tell me the distance of these legs, and I don't know the distance of the hypotenuse, the length of the hypotenuse. That is the unknown. That is c. We don't know what c is, and that's what we're asked to find. We're asked to find the length of the hypotenuse. So let's plug in the values that we know. I know A is one of these. It doesn't matter which one you call A and which one you call B. A and B are legs. Okay, so they're the sides of the right triangle that are not opposite of the right angle. And so let's call this A, and let's call this B. So a squared, I have 12, and remember, every time I plug in, I'm going to, of course, put that in parentheses, just like we've always done whenever you plug something in or substitute something in for something else. So a is 12, so I have 12 squared plus b squared. What's b? Well, we call this leg b, so b is 9. I have 9 in parentheses squared. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for c. What is the length of the hypotenuse? So I've set this up. I've plugged in my values for a and b. Now I need to evaluate. I need to solve this equation like normal, like we normally solve equations. I need to isolate c. I need to get c by itself. C on one side and everything else on the other side. Okay, so here I know that 12 squared is 144, right? Because that's what 12 times 12 is. Plus 9 squared. 9 squared is 81, right? 9 times 9 equals c squared. 144 plus 81, that's 225. So I know that 225 equals c squared. But I don't want to know what c squared is. I want to know what c is. So how am I going to isolate c? How am I going to get c by itself? Well, just like we've always done, we need to use inverse operations. Right? We know that addition and subtraction, those are inverse operations. They undo one another. Multiplication and division are inverse operations. They undo one another. Well, what undoes a square? What is the inverse of a square? Well, that would be a square root. Right? Square and square roots are inverse operations. Right? For example, we'll come back to this problem here in a minute, but let's say I have 3 squared. If I have 3 squared, remember that's the same as 3 times 3, that would be 9. So the number that I started with was 3. I squared 3 and I got 9. Now I want to go back to 3. So how am I going to get back to 3? How am I going to undo what I just did? How do I undo the square? Well, I take the square root of that number. The square root of 9 would be 3. Okay, so square and square root are inverse operations. Keep that in mind. So here, going back to the original problem number 1, I have 225 equals c squared. If I need to get c by itself, I have to take the square root of both sides, because the square root of a square is just this number, is just c. So the square root of c squared is just c. So c is equal to the square root of 225. Now, if you don't have that perfect square, because 225 is a perfect square, if you don't have that memorized, you need to use a calculator. You may use a calculator for this lesson. So here's my calculator. I hit the on button to turn it on, right? I need to hit, to put a square root into the calculator, you hit second, which in my calculator it's this blue button. I hit second. And then right here where it says x squared, I hit that. And that should get a square root sign, okay? And then I type in the number I'm taking the square root of, which is 225, and I need to close the parentheses. So I hit this parenthesis right here, the close parenthesis button. Okay, so I have 225 inside the square root. I'll hit equals, and that will tell me what the square root of 225 is, and it is 15. Okay, so c is equal to 15. That is this. That is the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is 15. So that would answer the question for number 1 in the Google form where it says, what is the length of the hypotenuse in triangle 1? You will just type in 15. Okay, don't put c equals 15 into the Google form. I've set it up where you only need to type in what c is. Okay, so don't type c equals, just type what c is into the Google form. So type in 15 for number 1. Okay, so you may use a calculator, but I still need to see all of this. Okay, all of this right here is showing work. Showing work. So when I say show me your work, I should see where you set it up, you plugged in, and you evaluated. You solved the equation for c. Okay? Yes, you can use a calculator, but you must show me your work on lined paper. So that's number 1. You'll do the same thing for 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way through the form. Okay? All 12 problems. Okay? The next one I want to do with you on this video is number 4. So we did number 1 together. Let's do number 4, and I'll also talk briefly about number 11. Okay? So go with me to number 4. Number 4 on your Google form. Now in number 4, notice they give us different parts of the triangle. Number 4 triangle looks like this. I have triangle ACB, ACB, and this is a right angle. I don't know the length of B. This would be A is 14, and C is the hypotenuse because it's opposite of the right angle. C is 23. Okay, so notice here I'm given different parts of the triangle. I know the hypotenuse, and I don't know one of the legs. Right? I know leg A. Leg A is 14. Leg B is the unknown. That's what I'll need to solve for. And I do know the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse, remember, is the side of the triangle opposite of the right angle. So the hypotenuse is 23. So if I'm going to solve for B right here, of course I set it up first. I set it up by putting A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Then I plug in. I plug in the values that I know. Well, I know A, right? A is 14, so I'm going to plug that into parentheses, 14 squared, plus B squared. I don't know what B is, so I'm just going to leave that for now, B squared, equals C squared. Well, what is C? I know that C is 23. That is the hypotenuse. C is always the hypotenuse, right? In this equation, A and B are legs. C is the hypotenuse, so 23 squared. Okay, so I have my equation. I just need to evaluate, solve this equation like normal. Get B by itself. Okay, so what is 14 squared? 14 squared is 196, right? That's 14 times 14. Plus B squared equals 23 squared. What is 23 squared? 23 times 23 is 529. Okay, so I need to move this 196 to the other side, right, to get b by itself. So I do the same thing to both sides. I subtract 196, that those cancel. I have b squared on the left side. B squared is equal to 529 minus 196 is 333. 333. So I have b squared, but I don't want b squared, I want b. I need to get b by itself. So how do I undo the square here? What is the inverse of squaring? Well, the inverse of squaring is taking the square root. And of course, if I take the square root of one side, I take the square root of the other side. That's the golden rule for equations. Whatever you do to one side of the equal sign, you do the same exact thing to the other side. So what's the square root of b squared? Well, they essentially cancel one another out. They undo one another. So all you're left with is b, which is what you want. You want to know what b is. So b is the square root of 333. So go ahead and put that in your calculator. Remember, you will hit second, then this x squared, so that we get a square root. Type in 333, close the parenthesis, and hit equals. 18.248288759. Well, in the Google form, remember it says, for number 4, what is the length of the missing leg, which we just solved for? And then the next sentence says, round your answer to the nearest tenth. The nearest tenth. Okay? So if we have 18.24 and so on, we're rounding to the nearest tenth, which is the first digit after the decimal point, right? That place value right there, that 2. And so if we're rounding to the nearest tenth, we look at this digit right after it, which is a 4. And if that number is less than 5, then we don't round up. We stay the same in the tenths place. So b, rounded to the nearest tenth, is 18.2. 18.2 is the length of the other leg, is the length of this b right here. Okay? So 18.2 is what you'll put in for your answer for number 4. Okay? Don't put b equals. Remember, just put what b is. B is 18.2 because that's rounded to the nearest tenth. All right? So that's number 4. Again, skip a line, go to the next one. The last one I'll talk about with you in this video is number 11. Okay, so number 11 says this. Number 11, a soccer field is 120 yards long and 60 yards wide. How long is the diagonal of the field? Round your answer to the nearest tenth. Okay, so I would draw a picture here when you have a word problem. Draw a picture. So the soccer field is 120 yards long, so 120 yards long, 60 yards wide, 60 yards wide. How long is the diagonal? So how long is it from here to here? How long is it from here to here? Do you see what we just created? There's a right angle right here. We would call each of these a leg. This is a leg. This is a leg. And what would this be called? The side opposite of the right angle? What is the side opposite of the right angle called? It starts with an H, right? The hypotenuse. The hypotenuse. Okay? So if you know the leg and the leg, you can find the hypotenuse, right? We would call one of the legs A, the other leg B, and of course the C, the side of the triangle opposite of the right angle, is C, the hypotenuse. So here we would set it up. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. Plug in A and B and solve for C like we did numbers back in number 1. Okay, so remember your homework is to complete this form. 12.1 form. All of your work should be shown on lined paper. You will turn this in tomorrow. Of course, make sure your first and last name is on it.